I'd like to get back and just review a little bit, so we're going to start that way tonight. We're going to look at, just for a couple minutes here, some of the things we looked at. You know, we looked last week at the fact that when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land, He warned them that they would forget Him and that they would follow after other gods. And when that happened, that He would punish them. And He said their punishment would be that they would be scattered. And we see that in Deuteronomy 28:64. He scattered them amongst all the nations, from one end of the earth to the other. He also warned them that they would be persecuted. And again, we see that in verse 65, that God would give them an anxious mind, and eyes weary with longing, and despairing heart. There would be persecution as they went from one nation to the other, as they were spread abroad. And then last week we looked at the fact that God also, let alone did He bring a curse upon them, but He brought a curse upon the very land itself. This land that He had promised Abraham, a land flowing with milk and honey. And because of that, and He says here in Ezekiel, He was going to make the land desolate because of the unfaithfulness of the Jewish people. And so we saw last week that God did just do that. I mean, this is a picture of Israel. You see the swamp area, the dry desert in the background, where all the topsoil has washed off the mountains into the valleys, creating wetlands where there were swamps, mosquitoes. Of course, mosquitoes brought malaria and other kinds of diseases. The people were sick. And we went through some of the things that occurred during that 1800 years while Israel was out of the land. Now, Israel was taken into exile by the Babylonians in about 650 BC, but they were returned to the land after 70 years. But then, after Jesus was here, and the rejection of Christ as Messiah in 70 AD, and then again at the end of the first century, or the end of the first century, the Romans came in, they destroyed Jerusalem, and they dispersed the Jews across the face of the Roman Empire. We saw last week that when this happened, the rainfall itself quit in Jerusalem, or in Israel. That Israel had always been blessed with spring rains and autumn rains. But when the Jews were driven from the land, the rainfall quit. The trees were cut down, the topsoil eroded, the sedimentation from the erosion created swamps, malaria weakened the population, and Israel became a haunt of jackals, which was exactly what the prophecies described. Now God also promised that at the end of this time, this end of His punishment, because, see, what God was doing is that God wasn't pouring out His wrath upon the Jewish people, but God was bringing judgment against them to bring them to repentance and salvation. It was punishment in order to, it was correction. Discipline, even as we would discipline our children, so God was disciplining the Jewish people. And so what many Christian scholars look at being God's wrath and the destruction of the Jewish nation and God ending His covenant with the Jews, we understand that God was correcting, bringing correction, a judgment against them, but it wasn't a judgment unto wrath. It was a judgment unto salvation, unto repentance. Much like if you or I would fall away, we hear that term backslide, turn away from the Lord is likely to correct us. He is likely to, bring hard times upon us, or, do things, allow things into our life that will make us think about the Lord, where we are, and bring us back to Him. And very much so, the same way with the Jews. And so, at the end of this period, this end of the judgment period, God tells us in Isaiah 51 that He would comfort Zion. Now, Zion, of course, is also Israel, is also, Jerusalem. They're sort of all kind of combined together. But He would comfort Zion. He would make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like the garden of the Lord. So we see that there's this background promise of God that when the Jews, when that time of disbursement was over, when God began moving in the Jewish people's hearts to bring them back into the land, as He had promised, that He would turn around and He would bless them and bless the land. And so beginning in about 1897, we see the Jews returning to the land. And we're going to be looking at that a little closer here later on. But as they began to return, they drained the swamps, they reestablished Israel's forests, they restored the farmland, they put thousands of acres back into production. And last week we looked at some of the pictures of the agriculture and things that are going on in Israel. And Israel literally, once again, became a land of milk and honey. God restored the rainfall. Now this isn't something that the Jews did. I mean, man doesn't have the ability to create rain. But God increased the rainfall every decade since 1900 to the point where it's now 450% more than it was at the turn of the century. 450% in a little more than 115 years, 117 years. So again, God is in the process of healing Israel and bringing his people back into the land. At one time, Israel was basically stripped of trees, and we talked about that again last week. They said that probably less than 1% of Israel actually had trees on it. This is a picture of the mountains of Israel today after reforestation. I mean, what a difference, huh?
I never guessed that it is.
Millions and millions of trees have been planted. And there are now around 287,000 acres of forest in Israel. So that might be small compared to what we're used to in Pennsylvania, but for Israel, which is only the size of New Jersey, that's a pretty good sized chunk of ground that is now forested. But this is what God can do. And of course, the people are planting the trees, but God is bringing the rain, and we see the land being restored. Now, the trees aren't only valuable for timber, and about 15% of Israel's timber is now grown in the country of Israel, but they also add, to the fruit production, grazing for animals, habitat for honeybees and wild animals, absorption of the carbon dioxide, recreational, all kinds of reasons that that we have the forests that are here in Israel today. They're being used for. And again, one last picture of the new vineyards that are being planted. And this is Israel. Look at the mountains in the background. Those are the mountains of Israel. And between the mountains and the vineyards is a desert area. But they are slowly moving out into the deserts. And Len and Cheryl, when they were here, they were talking about they live in the Negev Desert, which is the largest desert area in Israel. And Israel is now reclaiming that area. And they've even developed plants like potatoes that can be watered using salt water and that are growing in the desert. So God is doing miraculous things in Israel. Yes, Rick?
You have no pictures to compare what's going on in Israel to what's going on in the surrounding countries?
Well, I'll tell you, when you go to the border between Israel and Jordan or Israel and Syria, it is just like going from, the climates are totally different. I mean, it's totally, you cross the road and you go into a desert area. And some of the pictures I have a little bit later on might actually show that a little better. But Israel, right up to the border. I know when I was there, they were growing crops right up to the border, and then you could see the border because it was just this dead zone where there was nothing. Now we're going to start tonight. We're going to be talking about Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel, of course, was one of the prophets that God used to foretell not only the destruction and the judgment that Israel was going through, but that God spoke through about the restoration of Israel. Tonight we're going to look at the Valley of Dry Bones. Valley of Dry Bones. So we're going to look at Ezekiel, and we're going to look at verses, I believe, like 1 and 2. We're not going to do the whole thing tonight. If you want to read it yourself, it's Ezekiel 37, verses 1 through 14 as the entire story. But let me just set the stage. Ezekiel was taken to a valley where there had been a great battle And it was a valley of dry bones. It was a valley where thousands upon thousands had died in battle, and their bones were lying there bleaching in the sun, much like the picture we have before us. And God tells him that these bones that he sees represent the whole house of Israel. Okay, Israel had been taken into captivity. They were now residing in Babylon. Those who weren't in Babylon had gone to Egypt, where they had met an untimely end. And so the Jews were in captivity. They were wailing because they felt that it was the end. They would never see their land again. And they were crying out, "Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone, and we are cut off." And again, here's Ezekiel 37:1. "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, set me in the middle of a valley, and it was full of bones. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is cut off. It's gone, we are cut off." But then, God promises something else. He says to them, "This is what the sovereign Lord says, O my people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back into the land of Israel." See, God speaks over these dry bones. He has Ezekiel speak his word, and the bones begin to form back together, and the flesh comes back on the bones, and God breathes into these bones, and they become alive again. And in that way, God is demonstrating through that prophetic vision what he has planned for Israel. That though Israel might be laid out like old dry bones, though it might be dead bleaching in the sun, that he will bring them back and settle them in their own lands. And he did this for a reason. He did this so that the world might know that he is God. Okay? That it was for his honor. He had promised Abraham, and he was keeping his covenant with Abraham, and he was doing it for his honor. Verse 13, "Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them." Now this is ongoing. This isn't one of those prophecies that happens in an instant, but it's a prophecy that is happening over time. As the Jewish people are being drawn back into the land, as they are being resettled in the land, as the land is being restored, and as the things that we looked at last week take place as far as the land of Israel, what God is doing is slowly but surely, he is planting the seed of faith within the hearts and the minds of the Jewish people. If you were paying attention to the movie at all that was on, and I stopped it, the soldiers are in an area that used to be an old armory. And next week we'll watch a little more of it, but some of the things that happen there are nothing short of miraculous. And one of the things that happens is one of the men who, to protect his troops, he gets out of the trenches and he walks forward with a machine gun, driving the enemy back. And when he finally is fallen, he has been hit with enough rounds that said that would have taken down an elephant, and yet he was still able to move forward and protect his friends and the soldiers that were in the trenches until they were able to get away. Again, very much reminiscent of some of the stories we read in the Old Testament of David and his mighty man of valor. But God worked in those battles, whether it be in 56 or in 67 or any of those. God worked in those battles. And there were miracles that took place in order to bring Israel into existence today, Jerusalem back into the Israeli hands, and to protect Israel from the attacks it has gone through. So, in all of that, I believe God is doing in order to open the eyes of the Jewish people. Because realize that when they rejected Christ, we are told that they became blinded. And until a blind man until their sight is restored, they remain blind. And so God is slowly restoring the sight of the Jewish people that they once again can comprehend their God, the great Jehovah, who they will turn to and be saved. Here, again, in Ezekiel, God says, I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. And I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I am the Lord, have spoken, I have done it, declares the Lord. Here's the Wailing Wall. And the people that are coming up, this is the last remaining portion of the temple. And it actually was not the temple, but the wall that was built in order to make the Temple Mount where the temple sat. So this really wasn't a part of the temple itself, but a retaining wall. But it's the most holy place for the Jewish people. And they go, of course, you see lots of pictures there of them, but they go there and pray, and they will place their prayers, fold them up, and place them in the cracks of the rocks. But again, these are people who have made Aliyah, who have returned to Israel, and they are now, for the first time, worshiping the Lord near the Wailing Wall.
What was the fence between there?
Because the women are not allowed into that part on the left-hand side. That is only for the Orthodox. And I think they have to go through a cleansing ritual too. There's portions of the wall that is more holy than others. And I don't fully understand it, but that would be the courtyard of the Jew, and there was a courtyard of the women.
Mm-hmm.
In Isaiah 66, verses 7 and 8, God speaks about this rebirthing of Israel. We've talked about the last few weeks, Israel came into existence May 14th, 1948, in a way that no other nation in the history of the world has come into existence. It was by UN mandate, and it was in a moment, in an instant. Again, we're going to be looking here at a show, at a little flick I have here for you that's going to talk about that. But what Isaiah says, talking about Israel, says before she goes into labor, speaking, using the metaphor of a woman, before she goes into labor, she gives birth. Now, it tells us two things. One is that the birth of Israel was very rapid. But the other thing, as it points out, is that there is labor, but the labor happens afterwards. Israel became a nation in peace until the next day. And the day after, May 15th, all right, the entire Arab world went to war against Israel. And so the labor pains of Israel happened after the birth of Israel. The birth really was very peaceful, very anticlimactic. The UN made a vote. A few minutes after the UN voted and approved Israel becoming a nation, the United States actually gave its approval and its support to Israel. It was like less than 12 minutes later, President Truman gave his support to the nation of Israel, and much of the world followed after that, except for the Arab countries. And the Arab countries the next day, of course, went to war against Israel. Israel has really been in a constant state of war ever since that day. And if you ever look at the list of wars, you think, okay, well, you remember that's the War of Independence, and then there was the War for Jerusalem, and then there was the Yom Kippur War, and I can think of maybe one or two. I mean, there are scads of skirmishes and wars that they have been through. I mean, it's just constant, the battles that Israel has had to fight in order to maintain its existence there on that small sliver of land. But here again, before she goes into labor, she gives birth. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Speaking of the birth of Israel. Who has ever heard of such a thing? Who has ever seen such a thing? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? And I guess the answer really would be, no, it's never happened before. This has never happened. This is unknown in the entire history of man, that a nation would come forth in a day, and just in a moment. Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. So again, speaking of the birth of the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
I'm going to, again, I'm going to show you this. I actually just used the voice from CBN. I pulled slides myself, so I'm trying to get slides that matched up, but you just listen to the background on this, and again, some of it gets into what goes on during the Day of Independence on May 14th, 1948.
On the afternoon of May 14th, several council members met to approve the final draft of the Declaration. The text was approved unanimously, but just hours before it would be read, the new state still didn't have a name. Historical names like Zion and Judea were proposed and rejected. It was Ben-Gurion who decided that the name would be simply Medinat Israel, the State of Israel. 1 hour before the ceremony, council members rushed home to change their clothes, while a secretary quickly typed out the declaration. With just minutes to spare, Zev Sharef, the man carrying the final copy, couldn't get a taxi. So he hitched a ride to the museum. His car got pulled over for speeding, and a policeman started to write him a ticket. Sharef argued that the ticket wouldn't be legal because the British had left, and there was no longer any government to enforce it. Plus, he added, if you keep us any longer, there won't be a new government, because I'm the one holding the Declaration of Independence. The policeman waved them on, and just 1 minute before the ceremony, Sharef handed Ben-Gurion his speech. Despite the instructions for secrecy, the news had leaked out, and a large crowd gathered outside the museum. Jewish leaders were now racing the sunset to finish the ceremony before the Sabbath began at 5 o'clock. At 4 p.m., David Ben-Gurion called the meeting to order. The crowd rose and sang Hatikva. Then Ben-Gurion read the declaration aloud.
The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. Thus we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. We appeal to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to the proclamation on the soil of the homeland, in the city of Tel Aviv, on this Shabbat Eve, the 14th of May, 1940.
After each member of the new government had signed the proclamation, the orchestra played Hatikva once again. As the music died down, Ben-Gurion declared, "The state of Israel is established. This meeting is adjourned." It had taken just 32 minutes to bring independence to a people who had been without a country for 2,000 years.
Outside the museum, hundreds of people danced, while others wept. That night, Ben-Gurion wrote a simple entry in his diary.
Throughout the country, profound joy and jubilation. And once again, as on 29th November, I feel like the bereaved among the rejoicers.
Everybody was cheering in the streets. It was a big thing, dancing in the streets and all this. And he was standing in the back there. And he was asked, This is a great day. This is your dream come true. 2,000 years we're in diaspora. You didn't like the diaspora. You want Hebrew, you want a state, you want this, you've got it. He says, what the people are dancing here, what they don't know is tomorrow we got a war. And he said there's going to be a big prize.
As you can read in the New York Times there on May 15th, that even though Israel proclaimed a new state, Tel Aviv was bombed, Egypt orders an invasion, and of course the Arab nations attacked Israel that day. They were repelled, and we know the story from there. Israel is a nation today by the grace of God and by the hand of God. So it's really quite a story when you come to understand everything. But did you hear what he said? 32 minutes.
Yeah.
It says, go back to Isaiah, in a moment. In a moment. That nation was born. In 32 minutes. Unbelievable the accuracy that God spoke through a prophet 2,700 years before the fact. As we've been studying the Word, we have known there are 3 time periods that we will be looking at. We've already gone through the biblical period of prophecy as the past. There in the past we looked at the dispersion of the Jews, the persecution of the Jews, preservation of the Jews, the destruction of Israel. And that time period runs from about 722 BC when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel till about 1897. We're going to consider that the past. The section we're going to be looking at for the next few weeks is the present, and that really begins about 1897 and runs through today. Following our Christmas break, when we come back, we're going to be looking at the future, and that's tomorrow and beyond. What has God spoken that is yet to come? I know that a lot of you are very excited about that part of it. Well, I really like the history part because it kind of grounds us in what God is doing today and gives us that basis for faith to believe in what He's going to do tomorrow. In the past, again, we saw the dispersion of the Jews. Present, we're going to be looking at these things. The regathering of the Jews as people, the reestablishment of Israel as a nation, the restoration of the land, the rebirth of the Hebrew language, the reoccupation of Jerusalem by the Jews, the strength of Israel's military, and the focus of world politics upon Israel. Now, all of these things, realize this, all 7 of these things are spoken of repeatedly in prophecy. We didn't just pick these out of a hat, but these are all spoken of throughout the Old Testament and by Jesus Himself in the New Testament in prophecy. And so what we're going to be looking at tonight and in the days to come are fulfilled prophecies. God said, and it happened. Isn't that amazing? We sometimes, don't consider the power of the faith-building power of fulfilled prophecy. But again, we're going to be looking at that. And then in the future, again, as we come back from our break after Christmas, we're going to be looking at the tribulation, salvation of the Jewish people, and the millennial kingdom. So that'll be our future study. Tonight we're going to look at the regathering. So we're going to take the next while. And we're going to look at the regathering of the Jews as they came back into Israel. And this really again began in about 1897. Scripture for this is Ezekiel 37 verses 21 and 22. Now there are many scriptures that point to the regathering of the Jews. I'm giving you just 1 or 2, but you can find many scriptures that point to the regathering of the Jewish people. Ezekiel 37, 21 and 22, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over them, and they will never be 2 nations, but divided into 2 kingdoms. And again, speaking back when the nation was divided after King Solomon, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians. But here he's saying, I'm going to bring them back not just from Babylon, because some people would say, oh, well, God's talking about the return of the Jewish people from the Babylonian exile. That's not what he said, is it? He says, I'm going to bring them back from where? All over. We'll make it a little clearer in Isaiah 11:11. On that day the Lord will reach out his hand, what? A second time, and reclaim the remnant that is left of his people. The first time was when he brought them back from Babylon. Now he's reaching out a second time and bringing them back not just from Babylon, but from all over the world. From the east and the west, from the north and the south. All right, from all over, bringing them back into Israel. The Old Testament prophets promised repeatedly the day would come when God would regather the Jews to Palestine. Those of us who are alive today, we are witnesses to this remarkable event. Now this is 1947. Maybe I wasn't alive then, but many of you might have been. I know many of you were. 1947, as the Jewish people began flocking into Israel. Began coming into Israel, even before Israel was declared an independent nation. But again, the exodus back into Israel, the regathering of the Jews, began about 1897. And it began really the efforts of a Jewish journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl. And he was given the task of actually covering a trial. And it was a trial for a young Jewish man who had been accused of treason. Now, he was innocent. But what Herzl found was that people had already declared him guilty because he was a Jew. And he began to see the rise of anti-Semitism. This is way prior to World War II. This is 1890s. He began to see the rise of anti-Semitism, and he also noticed something else that he had never noticed before, and that was the fact that the Jewish people never really assimilated into the population of a country. Now that's a big word today, right? I mean, because we talk about all of these people coming into America, whether they're coming across the southern border or whether we're bringing them in out of the Middle East. They come with their own traditions and their own ideas, and instead of becoming Americans, what happens is they tend to set themselves up in their own little enclaves, their own little ghettos, and they preserve their own nationality, their own language, their own way of life, and they don't really become Americans. And the Jews have done this for centuries, ever since they were taken captive by the Babylonians. When they were in Babylon, they still worship Jehovah God. When they were driven out of Israel by the Romans, wherever they went, they took their faith with them. They took their culture with them. And they never truly assimilated or became a part of the countries around. And that's one of the reasons that they have been persecuted. They're always the odd man. You know how it is when we were kids? There's that one kid that dressed funny or wore his hair funny or looked funny or talked funny. And he was the odd man. He was the one that was going to get picked on. And it's that way with the Jews. They've never really assimilated. If you look at the Orthodox Jews, they continue to wear their hair in the loops, and they wear their clothing, the dark clothing, and they're just the way they act and the way they carry themselves, and they are keeping the culture that they grew up in, or that they are maintaining, and so they've never really assimilated. And so Herzl wrote a book, just a small book, just a pamphlet really, and it was the book was called The Jewish State, and in it he voiced the idea that the Jews should return to Israel and make it their homeland once again, because they had never really assimilated into the other country. Well, guess what? The idea caught on, and it was called then the Zionist movement. And actually, there was the first Zionist Congress came out of this in 1897. Well, you say, well, okay, Brian, this is, what's all this history got to do with what we're talking about? This is really the beginning of the modern age of Israel. This is really God moving to restore His people into the land. Okay, and so beginning shortly after the beginning of the first century, even prior to World War I, the Jews began making Aliyah. Aliyah is really just the return back to Israel. And we saw people, Jews, returning to what then was known as Palestine early on, even prior to World War I. Now, before World War I, does anybody know who owned Palestine?
The Brits.
The Turks, the Ottoman Turks. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. All right, the Turks were in control of the Middle East, and especially of Israel. And if you know anything about the Turks and the Jews are not best of friends. And so a lot of the Jews who were going back were really going back into really poor conditions. But they felt drawn back to Israel by God. Now, in World War I, God began setting the stage for the nation of Israel. The Turks sided with the Germans. And we all know in the end of World War I, Germany lost. The Turks lost. And the Allies then began divvying up the lands that the Ottoman Empire held, which was, of course, most of the Middle East. Nice oil-rich lands. And so England and France and those nations who were allies began dividing up, and England ended up with Israel. And so Israel, really was a wasteland. We looked at that. There was nothing there. There was no oil. There wasn't much of anything but a couple of Bedouin shepherds and some swampland. What are we going to do with this? And a bunch of Jews that they couldn't control because that was just the way they were. So England was more than happy when the Balfour Declaration was brought forth. And again, it was brought forth by the man by the name of Balfour. And the idea is that the government of England was going to be proactive in allowing the Jews to come back into Israel and to form a Zionist state. And England, for a few years, really was sided with Israel. The Jews began flowing back into Israel right after World War I. But then England found out that they were making the Arabs mad, and the Arabs had something that England wanted. What is that?
Oil.
Oil. It wasn't camels, it was oil. And so England began pulling out or reneging on the agreement that they made with Israel. But still, there were Jews still going into Palestine, but the flow rate slowed down, and the freedoms were not there that they thought they were going to have because England really was holding back in order to please the Arabs. Well, following World War I, we had an atrocity in World War II, and it was called the Holocaust. And I don't think there are any Holocaust deniers here. We know that the Jews of Europe suffered horrendously during the Holocaust. Almost 7 million were killed by Hitler and the Germans in concentration camps and other ways. But the Holocaust did something that nothing else could do. It drove the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel.
Yeah.
Up until World War II, the Jews really, even though they had an opportunity and some were making Aliyah and there were a number that had returned to Israel, it was just few. But after the Holocaust, after the horrors of World War II, the cry came out, never, never again. And we hear that sometimes in politics today. When Israel's up against the wall, that's their cry. Never again. We're not giving up. We're not going to allow someone to come in here and rule us. We're not going to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon and come and destroy it. Never again. And that was their call. We're going to have a land of our own, they said, and we are going to have our own state, and we're going to govern ourselves. And so, after World War II, Jews began to flood into Israel. In 1900, there were about 40,000 Jews in Israel. By the end of World War II, there were about 600,000. So more than almost 20 times the number grew in that first 45 years as the Jews began to return to Israel. Now Isaiah, again, says to the Jewish people, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bring your children from the east and gather you from the west." Look at what he's saying here. "I will say to the north, give them up. And I will say to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons and daughters from afar, and bring my sons from afar, and my daughters from the ends of the earth." Since World War II, there have been several great surges of immigrants, Jews, coming back into Israel. Both in 1956 and in 1967, Israel fought wars with their Arab neighbors. And because of these wars, Arabs in both Egypt, now Egypt is to the east of Israel, a little bit to the south, southeast, but the east of Israel, and then, of course, Saudi Arabia to the, I'm sorry, Egypt is to the west of Israel, Saudi Arabia is to the east of Israel, kicked the Jews out. And so God brought them back from the east and from the west. About 800,000 Jews returned to Israel out of the Arab lands, from the east and from the west. Well, to the north there was a great population of Jews in Russia. But Russia wouldn't let them immigrate. But when Mikhail Gorbachev came into power, and in 1990, he opened the floodgates and allowed the Jews to immigrate, to make Aliyah into Israel. And about 400,000 Jews returned to Israel out of Russia. From the east, from the west, and from the north.
I worked with one of those who came out of Russia.
Out of Russia? Well, I'll tell you what, let me make an advertisement right now. Next Tuesday morning, for prayer, and he'll be here. If you don't want to come for prayer, if you want to come around 10 o'clock, Boris Golden will be here. Boris works with Russian Jews. He and his wife both are working with the Jewish people in Russia. They present the gospel to the Orthodox Jews in Russia, also in New York City and in Miami. He will be here next Tuesday. We're just going to have a sharing time where he's going to share with the group. And you're all welcome to come. If you want to come and hear about some of the work that is being done with the Jewish population as far as evangelism and them coming to Christ, next Tuesday would be a good time to do it. But again, we see now, okay, the doors have been opened and the Jews have returned from the east and from the west and from the north. Well then, in 1991, Ethiopia was going through a civil war, and there was a door of opportunity that opened, and the Ethiopian government basically said, get them out of here. And so in about a 48-hour period, some 18,000 Ethiopian Jews were brought back into Israel. Now, El Al, the airline of Israel, set a world record that day in how many people they carried in one airplane. Can you guess how many are in this plane? This is a 747. All the seats have been gutted. Now remember, 747s have 2 layers. This is a 747. All the seats have been gutted. How many people? 1,300. And in fact, is when they landed, there were 2 more than when they started because 2 women gave birth on the way. That's a record that's never even been come close. 1,300 Ethiopians. And they said one of the reasons is because they were small people.
Yes.
All right. And the other was they took everything out of the air. But they were trying to get as many of the Ethiopian Jews out of the land and into Israel today. Now, I know that Ted and Bonnie support a missionary pastor in Ethiopia who is helping the Jews that remain there to make Aliyah into Israel. One of the things they have to do is, I guess, have a job and some kind of training. Is that correct?
Yeah, they do computer training, and so that they could be prepared for the outside world.
Be prepared for the coming. But again, this is from the south. So Just in these 4 instances we have seen, God fulfilled His word in Isaiah, I will bring my children back from the north and the south and from the east and the west. Now, we know that if we take this a little further, just recently, France has seen a huge migration of Jews leaving France and going into Israel because of the anti-Semitic climate in France. And so about 8,000 left in 2015, and I heard just recently, and I think it's been in the last couple of months, that there was 1 week where more Jews left France than left in all the last couple of years together. So we're talking thousands and thousands who have left France and come back into Israel.
I've actually heard that there's only 10,000 Jews in all of Europe anymore.
The total.
How correct that might be, but for what it's worth, I heard that recently.
I don't know the numbers that are left, but I know that there are a good many. And look at the spike. Look at the spike. From 2013 to 2014, more than doubled, and then it's more than doubled in 15 and 16 again of the number of Jews that are coming out of France and going into Israel, as God is calling His people back into the land. See, this is a fulfillment of prophecy that we are seeing today. And not just Ezekiel and Isaiah, but there's like 13 different books in the Old Testament that speak to the return of the Jewish people into the land of Israel. Jesus Himself spoke about it. And in Matthew 24, He said that Jerusalem would be trampled until what? Until the age of Gentiles was ended. So what is the age of the Gentiles? What's the age that we're in now? That time where God has turned His eyes on the Gentiles, on us, and has grafted us in, but not replaced the Jewish people. Now, at the end of our time, which is ending now, because Jerusalem is now in the hands of the Jews. And so there's a couple things there we look at. Number one is that the idea of the fig tree. Jesus said, when the fig tree buds and blooms, you will know that the time is near. Israel is the fig tree. Israel is budding and blooming. It's being replanted. It's growing, and the people are repopulating. It's a nation again today. And He says, a generation that sees that occur will see my return. And then He said that the Gentiles will overrun Jerusalem until their age is over, to the age of the end of the age of the Gentiles. Well, in 1967, the Jews took over Jerusalem. We're no longer in control of Jerusalem. The Jews are. The age of the Gentiles was ended that day. And since that time, God's eyes have slowly turned to the Jewish people. Now, it's not an all-at-once thing. But what we're seeing is we're seeing the setup for the end. We're seeing the setup for the rapture of the church and the return of Christ. All these things are aligning, not just, this way, but this way. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at later on in our second study, is how everything is converging. All the points that Jesus makes in Matthew 24, all of these points are converging to that point in the timeline when Christ will return. So again, we see that God is keeping His word to the Jewish people.